2 words, that is all it took to collapse what remained of her public credibility on the Epstein question. Not 2 words in isolation, not 2 words removed from context, but 2 words placed in a specific sentence in a specific email written at a specific point in time, and once that sentence entered the public record, nothing she had previously said about her relationship with Jeffrey Epstein could be understood in quite the same way again. Supreme friend. That is how Sarah Ferguson described Jeffrey Epstein in a private email, not a passing acquaintance. Not someone she had been unfortunate enough to be associated with through the social circles of her former husband, not a person she had made the mistake of trusting before she understood his true character. Her supreme friend, the word supreme is doing specific work in that construction. It is not simply the word friend with a qualifying adjective attached for color, it is the word friend elevated to its highest possible form. The friendship that surpasses other friendships, the connection that is the most significant of its kind. The relationship that sits at the top of the hierarchy of personal bonds, and this email was written in 2011. After his 2008 guilty plea in Florida for soliciting prostitution from a minor, after his imprisonment. After his registration as a sex offender, after his name had been in the public record as a convicted criminal for 3 years. Not before any of that was known, after. In 2011, with the full public record of his crimes established and available to anyone with access to a search engine, Sarah Ferguson wrote to Jeffrey Epstein and called him her supreme friend. The impact of that phrase on the public conversation about her Epstein relationship was immediate and severe. 7 charitable organizations that had maintained their associations with her through years of accumulated York family scandal, including the Newsnight disaster, the sting operation, the ongoing financial chaos, made the calculation in the weeks following the January 2026 document release that the specific language of that email was something they could not continue to absorb through continued association. Julia's House announced the end of its connection with her. The Natasha Allergy Research Foundation followed, the Teenage Cancer Trust. Prevent Breast Cancer, the British Heart Foundation, a children's literacy charity, organizations that had presumably survived the previous waves of negative press surrounding her name, concluded that supreme friend was a phrase that changed the calculation in a way that everything that had come before it had not. The City of York Council voted unanimously to revoke her freedom of the city, an honor given to her at her wedding in 1987 as a symbol of the city's welcome and regard. The councillor who spoke during the debate put the council's position directly. They did not expect recipients of the honor to be saints, but they did not want to formally honor someone who had described a convicted pedophile as a supreme friend. The phrase itself was the specific thing that made the revocation not just justified, but, in the council's unanimous view, obviously necessary. Why did those 2 words land with the force they landed with? Not simply because they demonstrated ongoing contact with Epstein after his conviction, though they did that. Not simply because they showed warmth toward someone with a documented history of criminal behavior toward young women, though they showed that too. But because of the specific and irreconcilable gap they created between what she had said publicly about her relationship with Epstein and what the private record showed she had been experiencing in that relationship at the same time. She had publicly distanced herself from Epstein. She had made statements about having nothing to do with him. She had in one specific and well-documented moment in 2011, shortly before the email with the supreme friend language, publicly criticized Epstein and expressed what she described as deep regret about her association with him. Those public statements existed in the record, and then, in the same period, the private record shows her writing to Epstein to apologize for the public criticism and describing him as her supreme friend. The coexistence of those 2 things, the public denunciation and the private apology, the public distance and the private intimacy, is the specific form that the damage took, not just the ongoing contact. Not just the warmth, the simultaneous maintenance of a public narrative and a private reality that were moving in opposite directions. The performance of the appropriate moral response while the actual relationship continued in the same character it had always had. This is the detail that made the Supreme Friend phrase so significant, and why it generated the institutional response it generated, and why the Austrian Alps and the 213 days of deliberate absence and the managed invisibility all follow from it with a certain logic. Because once that gap is established in the documentary record, once the world can see with time-stamped specificity that the public story and the private reality were different things, the question of everything else she has said becomes a different kind of question, not just about Epstein. About the public narrative and the private reality more generally, the email was not the only communication that became part of the public record. The pattern of correspondence that the January 2026 document releases established was considerably more extensive than any single phrase. There was the 2009 email in which she asked for his address and mentioned she would be visiting with her daughters. The response she apparently received, and the apparent ease and familiarity of the exchange, suggested a connection that had been running comfortably for some time rather than one that was being conducted with appropriate caution towards someone whose character had been publicly established. There was the email about urgent rent money, £20,000 required immediately, the landlord threatening to go to the newspapers, the specific extremity of someone who has run out of options. There were communications whose tone, across multiple messages at multiple points in time, consistently registered as the language of genuine personal closeness rather than the language of someone managing a residual connection they wished they could fully sever. The Supreme Friend phrase sits within that pattern, but it crystallizes it. It is the moment when the language stopped being simply warm and became specific, supreme. The person she is describing is the best version of the relationship category she is using for him, not a friend. The Supreme Friend, after his conviction, after his imprisonment, after all of it. The financial dimension of the relationship, which the documentary record establishes alongside the personal dimension, provides the essential context for understanding how this level of attachment to this particular person was possible. The £20,000 urgent rent request is the most discussed example, but it was not isolated. Multiple communications appear to have involved appeals for financial assistance or discussions about how her financial problems might be resolved. Epstein's responses engaged with those discussions in ways that went beyond the simple provision of money. He apparently considered the reputational dimensions of various arrangements, strategized about how situations might be managed if they became public, positioned himself as someone who was not simply a source of financial relief, but a partner in managing how that relief would look and be explained. That combination, the financial support and the narrative management, is the specific mechanism through which Epstein built the dependencies that made severing contact practically impossible for people in his network. He did not simply provide money. He created entanglement. He made himself simultaneously the source of relief and the manager of how the relief was framed, which meant that distancing from him required not just forgoing his financial support, but also forgoing the specific form of protection that his involvement in managing her public narrative provided. For someone in Sarah Ferguson's financial situation, chronic, severe, repeatedly arriving at points of acute emergency, that entanglement was almost by design impossible to cleanly exit. This is not offered as an excuse. Understanding how something happened is not the same as accepting that it was acceptable. The email was written after the conviction. The relationship continued, in the form the documents show, with full knowledge of who he was and what he had done. The choice to maintain it, however constrained by financial dependency and however shaped by the specific dynamic Epstein cultivated, was still a choice. Made by an adult with access to the same public information as everyone else. The accountability that the charitable organizations and the City of York Council exercised in response to the documents is real accountability, applied appropriately. But the full account of how the relationship developed and persisted requires engagement with the specific mechanisms that made it persist, rather than simply registering the fact of its persistence as evidence of moral failure and moving on. Because the same mechanisms are operating in the backgrounds of many of the other relationships that Epstein maintained across his network, and understanding them is part of understanding the broader story rather than simply the Sarah Ferguson component of it. She has strongly denied the specific allegation that she brought her daughters to visit Epstein after his 2009 release from prison. That denial is part of the documentary record and should be stated without equivocation. Neither she nor her daughters, according to her representatives, have any memory of such a visit. The allegation appears in the documents and has been reported. The denial is equally part of the record and deserves the same acknowledgement. For Beatrice and Eugenie, the emergence of the email language into the public record represents the specific and most acute form of the collateral damage their parents' choices keep generating. Their names appear in the 2009 communication in the context of a visit that their mother has denied. Their mother's private description of a convicted sex offender as her supreme friend is now part of the public record in a way that cannot be reversed. The specific term, supreme friend, is the phrase that every future piece of reporting on the York family's Epstein connections will quote, because it is the most specific and the most damning single piece of language available in the entire documentary record. The daughters were not responsible for that email. They were not responsible for the relationship it describes. They were not responsible for the choices that made the £20,000 urgent rent request necessary, or the choices that kept the relationship going after the conviction made it indefensible. None of that was their doing. And yet the phrase sits in the public record in a way that will be read against their names every time the broader story of the York family's Epstein connections is referenced, because they are part of that family and the email forms part of that story. The Austrian Alps, the 213 days of deliberate absence, the managed invisibility that required white caps and oversized glasses, and the specific discipline of staying inside the suite and ordering room service, and avoiding the communal areas where other guests might see her, all of that follows from the moment those two words entered the public record. Supreme friend. The phrase that the public and the charitable organizations and the City of York Council all read the same way, and that produced institutional consequences across multiple domains within weeks of the documents being released. She called herself resilient. The word appears in her own public account of herself across multiple iterations of the narrative she has constructed about her life. Resilience is the quality she returns to when other framings become unavailable. And there is genuine resilience in her story, the recovery from the sting operation, the cancer diagnoses faced publicly, the multiple commercial reinventions, the specific quality of continuing to show up that has characterized her public life even at its most difficult points. But resilience, in the context of the current situation, runs into a problem that previous difficult periods did not present in the same form. The documentary record is not a perception problem. It is not an image problem that can be addressed by the right interview in the right format with the right framing and the right combination of honest acknowledgement and sympathetic narrative. The phrase is there. The timeline is there. The gap between the public statements and the private communications is there. Resilience cannot change what the documents say. It can only determine how the person they describe responds to the world's knowledge of them. The response she is apparently formulating, the potential interview, the possible documentary, the memoir being reportedly developed alongside the public negotiations, is the commercial version of her resilience. The conversion of the current situation into the next commercial opportunity, in the way that previous situations have been converted into previous commercial opportunities. The question of whether this particular situation is convertible in the same way is the question that the supreme friend phrase makes genuinely difficult to answer with optimism. Because every previous reinvention happened in a context where the gap between the public narrative and the private reality, however large, was not yet part of the documentary record in the specific, detailed, time-stamped form that the January 2026 releases produced. Previous reinventions could construct a new version of her story because the old version was a matter of competing claims rather than documented contradictions. The Supreme Friend email is a documented contradiction. It exists independently of any competing narrative. It says what it says on the date it was written, and it will continue to say what it says regardless of what interview format or documentary structure or memoir framing is eventually used to present her version of events. She is somewhere in Europe, moving between locations. The Austrian refuge compromised and abandoned. the wealthy friends network absorbing her current requirements in ways that the question of who is paying for all of this keeps raising without fully answering. The commercial negotiations continuing for a project whose specific parameters keep running into the specific problem that the documentary record creates for every version of the story she might tell. 2 words. Supreme friend. The phrase that changed the calculation for 7 charities and a city council and the public and the daughters trying to maintain managed distance from a story that keeps generating new reasons to manage more distance. The phrase that sits in the January 2026 documents and that will sit in the historical record long after the Austrian Alps episode is forgotten and long after whatever interview or documentary eventually gets made has been broadcast and discussed and filed away. She called him that after his conviction in a private email that she presumably did not expect to ever become public. In the specific register of genuine intimate feeling rather than managed public statement. Supreme friend. And that is now irrevocably part of the documented record of the relationship between Sarah Ferguson and Jeffrey Epstein. Not the whole record, but the most quotable part of it. The 2 words that will follow her name through the rest of the public conversation about this story. The question of how she navigates that personally, commercially, institutionally is still being answered. Somewhere between the wellness retreats and the media negotiations, and the daughter's careful distance, and the city council that voted unanimously, and the charities that ended their connections, and the congressional request that has received no response, and the documents that keep being released from the Epstein archive that the public assumed was closed, but that has proved considerably more open than anyone on its edges hoped it would be. Supreme friend. 2 words. Everything that follows from them.